The Arctic is undergoing a transformation. It's driven by global warming and intense global competition.
Global tensions find a new stage in the warming Arctic.
Tonight, the U.S. closely monitoring growing military cooperation between Russia and China.
The Arctic is no longer a low-tension region.
You've got the incoming U.S. president calling the Arctic a top priority and promising to drill for oil and gas. Canada is massively beefing up its military presence, investing $72 billion over the next couple of decades into Arctic defense. And Russia and China working together on what they call a polar Silk Road.
There are more people, more interested eyes looking to the Arctic.
So why exactly is all of this happening now? Let's go through it. The Arctic is opening up. These thick blocks of ice are melting, clearing the way for ships to travel through. According to the Canadian government, by 2050, the Arctic Ocean will become an increasingly viable shipping route between Europe and Asia during the summer.
By the middle of this century, there will be no polar ice cap at the height of summer.
That's a big deal, because right now, the fastest way to ship goods from Europe to Asia is through the Suez Canal in Egypt. But, as we've seen more and more, the Suez Canal is not always the most reliable route.
A giant container ship ran aground in the Suez Canal after losing power.
Civilian shipping in the Red Sea has become more collateral damage to the war in Gaza.
So what if, instead of going down south and passing through the Middle East, you could go north and use the Arctic Ocean as a shortcut across the globe? There are essentially two ways you could do this. One is using what's known as the Northwest Passage. This would take you through the Arctic on the North American side, weaving through Canada's northern archipelagos. The other route through the Arctic is known as the Northern Sea Route. This one passes through the Russian side of the Arctic Ocean, along the Siberian coastline. Both of these routes offer a much shorter path between Europe and Asia than the Suez Canal. It shaves off up to 5,000 kilometers. That's a third of the trip, or up to a full week of travel. And the warmer the ocean gets, the easier those routes become to navigate. Countries realize this potential, and so there is a battle for control.
Even non-Arctic states are looking to the Arctic and inserting themselves into the Arctic as much as they can.
It has potential shipping lanes. It has a tremendous endowment of natural resources.
The Arctic is full of untapped gold, nickel, copper, diamonds, platinum, and researchers believe it's holding about 90 billion barrels of oil and 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas. And all of this is creating incredible tension, partly because no one can seem to agree which parts of the Arctic belong to whom, and because the prospect of friendly negotiation is shrinking. Shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, the Arctic Council, which is the place where Canada, the US, Nordic countries, and Russia all got together to discuss these issues, they stopped meeting entirely, which brings us to North America's most pressing concern when it comes to the Arctic.
Guardrails that prevent conflicts are increasingly under immense strain. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine has led us all to ask, who's next?
Up here on the top of the world, there is a vast expanse of ice and of emptiness. And yet Russia has made deploying its military up here to these extreme conditions a real priority.
Russia has, by far, the largest share of Arctic territory. Almost a quarter of its territory is north of the Arctic Circle, and it controls 24,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline. Over the past few years, it has been steadily building up its military presence in the area, investing in air bases, naval ports, icebreaker fleets, upgrading its submarines. Russia says this is to deter adversaries from even considering a potential attack, and to show that if an attack came, they would defend themselves at all costs.
Historically, Russia's northern coast there was protected by ice, and there wasn't a lot of traffic. And so as the ice is retreated, and all of a sudden it's sort of like this potential, attack point.
But all of this has the West on edge because it knows Russia is not content simply to defend its holdings. It wants to expand. its sphere of influence.
We now have 7 of the 8 Arctic states are NATO, and Russia is not NATO. That can create conditions for tension.
People in North America have become a lot more concerned about what the Russians are up to, what Vladimir Putin is up to.
After the end of the Cold War a few decades ago, Russia closed dozens of military bases in the Arctic. It also agreed to a low-tension approach to Arctic disputes. But over this past decade, it has reopened 50 of those military bases. It's estimated that Russia now has nearly double the number of military bases in the Arctic than Canada, the US, Denmark, and Norway combined. And over the past year, it has ramped up weapons testing in the region too, including testing of hypersonic cruise missiles that Russia says fly at 9 times the speed of sound and have a range of over 1,000 kilometers.
The Arctic is the shortest distance between North America and Eurasia. And so if you are shooting missiles between those two continents, you're going to go over Arctic routes.
This Russian military base in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, for example, is actually closer to Canada's military base in Nunavut than Nunavut is to Ottawa or Toronto. And just look how close this Russian military airbase is to Alaska. According to NORAD, that's the organization that tracks and protects North American airspace, Russia has been testing bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons from this peninsula, at times coming within just 50 nautical miles of Alaskan territory. Now, to be clear, there's no reason to believe that Russia plans to actually use these bombers to attack North America. But the fact that they're testing them that close to the US has them and Canada thinking maybe they should beef up their military presence in that area too.
Americans are nervous because they just don't know what to expect.
I think given the situation with Russia and sort of global geopolitical competition with China, we are very concerned about making sure that our missile defense architecture is fit to purpose.
And it's not just missile defense systems the West is focused on when it comes to the Arctic.
This is Polar Dagger, a mission intended to show Russia's decision makers what the U.S. military can do in the remote areas of the Arctic.
Between January and March of 2024, NATO conducted its biggest joint military exercise since the Cold War, called Steadfast Defender 24. One of its main focuses, the Arctic. NATO says the goal was to show their ability and intent to reinforce and defend the Nordic region in the event of Russian aggression, and to show their capability to carry out such operations in Arctic terrain.
We have a large number of Marines who have never been in the snow in their life before.
Say, for instance, in a future conflict, being able to fly with different countries, just the one that is on station in that area at that time, is making us 100 times more dangerous.
20,000 soldiers, 50 plus ships, more than 100 aircraft from 13 countries were involved in these Arctic drills. Russia took this as a provocation. And since then, things have really started to ramp up. The Chinese military is involved too. In July, the US released this photo that they say shows joint flights by Russian and Chinese bombers near Alaska's coast. A few months later, China and Russia openly announced they were running joint aerial and sea patrols in the area. This video, recorded from the cockpit of a US F-16 flying near Alaska, shows a Russian fighter jet maneuvering within just a few feet of the American plane in September.
We're seeing activities by foreign states that are approaching northern communities, and that's a real problem.
Analysts have for a long time argued that Canada's Arctic is much too vulnerable. And that shows not just on a military and national security level, but among people who've lived there for generations.
In terms of airfields, in terms of naval and civilian port facilities, in terms of roads that are durable, that can survive climate change, massive underinvestment historically. And that's had an impact on the flourishing of civilian communities, but it's also had an impact on the ability of Canada to defend its sovereignty claims in the high north.
Canada's Department of National Defense underscored that very point recently in showing just how many fewer active personnel are stationed there right now. And the infrastructure, those important airports, naval ports, and bases, they are also too few, and what's there is in rough shape. 40% of the buildings are more than 50 years old.
We do not have the capacity to fight very hard in the north. We don't have the equipment, we don't have the training, we don't have the forward stations, we don't have supply depots. So Canada has a long way to go to get to, say, where Alaska is, but also even to get to where Scandinavia is, particularly where Norway, Finland, and Sweden are. They're very heavily militarized compared to Canada's north.
So Canada's plans are as follows. The government is investing more than $70 billion over the next 2 decades into new icebreakers and patrol ships, drones, special aircraft that track enemies in the air, on the surface of the ocean, and even underwater, dozens of fighter jets. The list goes on. But more than half of that investment is being funneled into NORAD, into new high-tech surveillance systems and upgrades to infrastructure like the airfields NORAD uses.
Some analysts say we should get ready for this. We didn't think Russians would invade the Ukraine, and there they are, well into a deep war. Integration with the United States is a huge part of our defense strategy.
When you look at the document, it actually talks about the North American Arctic.
That really does yoke the US and Canada together very closely. It makes it clear that the US and Canada would be a team together in the Arctic, and that we should be approaching some of our challenges together.
Analysts say this shows Canada is taking a significant step in the direction that the US wants it to go in, to begin to address its vulnerabilities in the Arctic, and to shore up what is about to become a key battleground for resources and global influence. The stakes are only going to get higher.